Welcome to How We Read, a sensory history of books for blind people. This exhibition explores the history of reading technologies designed to help blind people over the past 2 centuries. I'm Matthew Rubery, and this is Heather Tilley. And we're at the RNIB, the Royal National Institute of Blind People's Archives, and we're going to show you some of the items that make up our exhibition.
Thanks, Matt. So today I'm going to be looking at some items that relate to the history of embossed literature for blind people in the 19th century, and Matt's going to be looking at some objects related to the history of talking books and also reading machines for blind people. We really hope that this exhibition, this talk, makes people think about the many different ways in which we do something as simple, as seemingly simple as read a book. There had been different experiments in different ways of helping blind people to read. The primary mode that blind people were dependent upon was having somebody else read to them. Embossed literature was designed to change that and allow blind people to directly read text themselves in private and without the aid of sighted readers. So experiments had started in Paris and in Europe at the end of the 18th century, as I've said, but it did take a little bit of time for embossed literature to reach Britain. And on display here on this table we have 4 items which kind of tell some of that early history of embossed literature in Britain. Embossed literature was brought into Britain by a Scottish publisher called James Gall, who had travelled to Paris and been impressed by what he'd seen there. He was from a religious society and was quite keen that blind people might also have the opportunity to read spiritual texts by themselves. So Gall set to work and invented his own system of embossed writing that was based on the Roman letter, so the alphabet that sighted people used, and he made slight modifications to that. He made it slightly more triangular, so he argued it would be more easy for blind people to feel with a finger. So what we have on display here at the front is a small class book that was published in Gall type. This is from the 1840s, but it's indicative of some of the early books that he was printing. It's quite small, though it was quite a difficult technology to actually to produce. So early books tended to be quite small in format, and this is kind of exemplary of that, really. It's in Gall's triangular alphabet, and it's supposed to be a class book, but what's interesting about this book is that actually when we read the content of it, actually a lot of it is actually about sin and about religion. So on this page, which is open, we move from the first text starts, go on, go up, do so, and then we end this page with sin is not hid, God can see. And it's kind of in this vein. So there's a very close relationship between religion and embossed literature, and this book really kind of exemplifies that. So as I said, some of the early class books were quite small, quite lightweight. This book is about 5 centimetres high and about 15 centimetres long. They were originally embossed from wooden plates that couldn't really withstand too much heavy printing and pressing. So some of the early discussion and debate around these books was how to improve publishing technologies. The book that we have behind this small class book is an early Bible, a copy of the Gospel of St. John that was printed in Gall type. Soon after Gall introduced his printing invention, he sent out a notice to people asking them to send in money to help him get a Bible off the ground. And this Bible from 1832 is an example of that. So this is one of the first embossed Bibles for blind people in Britain. And this book is noticeably bigger than the class book. It's about 30 centimetres high and about 20 centimetres wide. And it's about 5 centimetres deep. And it's just open on a page of text from the Bible, again in Gall's angular type. Gall's experiment and invention really kind of caught the imagination of early 19th century educators and philanthropists and people interested in the issue of blind education. And very soon after the publication of the 1827 class book, in fact within 5 years, a competition was held in Edinburgh asking people to contribute different types of alphabets for blind people, and then a committee judged the best result. So one of the things that I want to draw attention to in some of the items that I'm going to talk through today is one of the big debates really that defined the early history of embossed literature, and that was whether or not an alphabet for blind people should be based on the Roman letter, so the alphabet that sighted people were used to reading, or whether it should maybe do something a little bit more different, whether it should be designed actually with the perceptual faculties of the finger in mind. So within 5 years of Gall's book being printed, a competition was held in Edinburgh that invited people to contribute different ideas for different raised alphabets. Over 19 alphabets were submitted, and actually the large number of those weren't actually based on the Roman letter. They were what were known as arbitrary scripts, arbitrary alphabets. But the prize, the gold medal, actually went to an alphabet that resembled the Roman letter. So there was quite a strong sense in the early kind of years of embossed literature that there should be similarity between blind people's reading material and sighted people's. So what we have here, on this side, we've got a Bible from 1837, and this is in Alston type. So Alston type was invented by John Alston, who was director of the Glasgow Asylum for the Blind. And often we find that the different systems for embossed literature were actually very closely tied to particular institutions and places. So John Alston had developed his system, which was actually based on the winner of that 1832 competition, an alphabet by a man called Dr. Fry. And his alphabet is very, very close to the Roman letter. In fact, it's as a sighted person, it's very easy to read Alston's type. He uses capital letters without serif fonts, and there's no contractions, there's no simplifications. It's the Roman letter just raised. Alston had a lot of support for his alphabet, and it was one of the leading early alphabets in the 1830s and 1840s. And he printed in the 1830s an edition of a multi-volume edition of the Bible. And what we have on display here is the New Testament of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ in raised letters for the use of the blind. And again, it's a similar size to the Gospel of St. John's in Gall type. It's about 20 centimetres wide and about 30 to 35 centimetres high, and about 3 centimetres deep. Alston, as I said, had quite a lot of money and a lot of support behind his press in the early days. He was very good at promoting his system, and there was strong debate and contentious debate around whether or not a system should be something that the sighted people could also use, or whether it should be arbitrary. Alston in the early kind of days was really kind of winning the debate, and he had a lot of investment in his system. And this meant that actually there were quite a lot of different types of books printed in Alston type. So what we have on display here is actually one of my favourites. It's a book called A Peep into the Menagerie of Birds, and it's from 1842. So it's 5 years after the Bible that we have on display here. And this book, it's a very slim book. It's only a couple of millimetres thick. It's about 7 centimetres high and about 15 centimetres long widthways. And it features different plates and texts on different birds. So it's it's an attempt at natural history. And what we have here, it's open on a page called The Robin Redbreast, and it features a simple raised illustration of a robin redbreast, and then some text accompany it describing the bird as well. So just to give you a flavour of the type of material, the first line reads, "This bird derives its name from the peculiar appearance of its neck and breast, which are of a fine, deep orange red." Just to give you a sense of what the text is like. Now we're going to have a look at some of the different arbitrary scripts that were invented and that were used by blind people in the 19th century. And on the table we've got 4 items that relate to this story. The first book that I want to talk about is this gospel. It's another gospel embossed in Lucas type. And just to give you a quick description, it's opened on its frontispiece. On the left-hand side, we have some visible ink print text, which reads The Gospel According to St. John, edited by T.M. Lucas. And on the right-hand side, we then have corresponding embossed print. And the book is about 20 centimetres wide, about 30 centimetres high, and it's about 3 centimetres deep. So Thomas Lucas was a shorthand teacher originally, and he became, like many other people, interested in this issue of blind people's literacy in the 1830s, and he thought he could do something to help. So he developed a system that was based on shorthand or stenographic principles, and he invented his system in the 1830s. So this system basically uses contracted forms, so it combines letters, it has symbols for commonly used words, and therefore it reduced the length of sentences and word scripts. So he felt that this was going to be beneficial to blind readers. And it uses 12 different symbols which are positioned in different ways. Lucas was involved with the Bristol Society for the Blind. They supported his system, and it had quite a lot of success in the middle decades of the 19th century. I like this book because what's interesting about this book is that we also have an inscription at the top, handwritten in ink. So above the Gospel According to St. John, we have the inscription Harriet Curry. And there's a poem at the back of the book which also kind of details the occasion in which this Bible was gifted to Harriet Curry. So here we actually have an example of a Bible that belonged to a particular reader as well. So this is an interesting book in that respect. Just walking around to this side of the table now. Another early popular arbitrary script was one invented by James Frere, who was associated with charitable institutions in London and Liverpool. And again in the 1830s, James Frere, who was sighted, felt that he had good ideas to help develop an embossed script. So his idea was to basically create an alphabet that was based on the sounds of letters. So he created a symbol for every sound that he identified in the English language. And then he also created a special memory technique to help people to remember those different symbols. So what we have on display here, we actually have a pamphlet that he produced explaining and outlining his system. And it goes through all the different sounds in the alphabet he identifies, as well as the symbols in his alphabet as well. And we have, it's open here on pages 2 to 3. And I'm just going to read out, just to give you a sense of maybe how easy or how difficult it was for people to actually memorise his technique. So the symbol for L, which is a semicircle with its curved side touching the bottom, his memory technique for this is a half circle looking upwards is L. L lies level and looks like a lake. So these were the types of tools that he encouraged people to use to try and remember the different symbols. But again, Frere, because there were contractions allowed in this system, Frere felt that it would be easier for blind people to use, and the symbols would be easier as well for the finger to read rather than the Roman letter. And what we have on display above this is actually an example of a book that's printed in Frere type. So this is, again, it's a common theme that's emerging, The Gospel According to St. John, which is published in Frere type. And this is quite a sizable book. It's about 20 centimetres high and about 35 centimetres wide and about 3 centimetres deep. And it's on the first page we have it includes a grammar and a code to the system, and this was quite a typical feature of early embossed books. They would come printed with a code to help people interpret the alphabet. So it has a short grammar for the use of the blind scholar by James J.H. Frere, and then we turn the page and we're into the text itself. One of the other contributions that Frere made was that he also flipped the sentence structure, so the sentence tracking rather. So we have at the end of every line, we actually have little curves which are intended to guide the reader to basically reverse their finger and read the next sentence backwards, so to help people keep their place as they're reading the embossed text. So this was one of the features that he contributed and invented as well. Finally, I'm just going to come around to the other side of the table. And I want to draw your attention to an alphabet that never really gained very much popularity at the time, but it's nonetheless very interesting and I think raises lots of interesting questions for us today when we're thinking about issues around control and access over reading formats. And this is a book called The New Puntiuncular Sternographic System for Embossing, by which the blind four nations will be able to emboss for themselves. And it's by a man called George Hughes. It's from the 1840s. Now, Hughes was actually himself blind, and he felt that, again, the attempts that he'd made to read texts that were embossed in the Roman letter, he found it very difficult. So he decided to try and invent a system that would be more easier for him to read by the finger. And I'm just going to turn this book around because what we have here printed on the frontispiece is actually the code to his alphabet. And what's interesting about this is that in some ways it resembles Braille because it uses dotted symbols arranged in a cell. So Hughes invented a system that was incorporated contractions, was symbolic, and he felt this would be easier to read by the finger. What Hughes also talks about in this book and in other places is he expresses the sense that perhaps sighted people who were predominantly at this point in control of embossed literature as educators or educators in asylums or inventors attached to charitable institutions, he felt that actually maybe sighted people were reluctant to give up embossed literature to a symbolic system because they would be worried about not being able to read it themselves. And he described this in terms of the selfish feeling of wanting to have a power of writing unto themselves. So he talks about it in terms of power as well, which is very interesting, and suggested that actually blind people might be the best place to actually decide on the correct format for embossed literature, or the most effective format for embossed literature. So although it wasn't very popular, it's actually very interesting, a very interesting example. And this copy is in the RNIB archive as well. So towards the latter part of the 19th century, there were several different embossed scripts in circulation in Britain, being used in schools and in home teaching societies up and down the country. So this created particular problems. People get used to reading in one system, and then if that system became obsolete, for example, if the inventor died, as happened with Alston type, then future books weren't printed in that, resources became scarce. It also created competition between different systems, as there was obviously limited pots of money being invested in the different formats, and it made it difficult for different printing presses to build up and expand their reading list. So people are often confined to very limited sets of text, most usually the Bible and scriptural texts, with not very much other material available. By the 1860s, one of the leading types, there are about 5 or 6 different main types in circulation, and one of the leading systems was a system called Moon type. Which is still partly in use today. And what we have on the table here, we've got 3 objects on the table, but the book that I'm going to talk about first is this rather lavish and heavy book, which is printed in Moon type in 1871. And it reads on the front cover, "By special permission of Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen's Journals, Life in the Highlands, in type for the blind." And this is a very lavishly produced book. It's got gilt edging on the front. The pages are marbled. It looks expensive and luxurious. Moon type had been invented by William Moon in the 1840s and 50s. Moon had actually lost his sight in later life, and again he became interested in this issue of how can blind people read, and he set about inventing different systems. And the system that he eventually settled upon was one that actually adapted the Roman letter, modified the Roman letter, but removed some of the extra curves and strokes to make it more easily perceptible by the finger. So Moon's alphabet was an adaptation of the Roman letter. It became incredibly popular. Part of Moon's rationale was that it would be easier for people who'd lost their sight, who had acquired visual disabilities, to learn, because they would still have memory of having read the Roman alphabet. Moon was also very evangelical and very committed to his system, and was an incredibly effective promoter. So in his memoir of the 1870s, in 1872, he detailed there how Moon's type was being circulated all across the world. It was translated into 80 different languages. It had a huge reach. He had premises in Brighton that were rapidly expanded, and they invested a lot in different technologies, new systems of plating and printing, and it had a real kind of sense of drive and resources behind it. And I think this book is actually a really good example of the status with which Moon's type was held in the 1870s. So I'm just going to open it up just to show you some pages. So here, in the first few pages, we have the alphabet of Moon reproduced. So again, it's this technique really of using the different alphabets of the embossed scripts as codes, publishing them as codes in the front of the books. And it runs through, so the page open here runs through the different alphabetic letters of Moon type. And then I want to draw your attention to this illustration, which raises some interesting questions for us. It's an illustration of Balmoral. It's brightly coloured. It depicts the palace set against a blue sky with a green lawn stretching in front of it, and the palace itself is slightly is outlined in slightly raised lines. So it's supposedly something which might be read or felt by touch. But it's also something which belongs very much to the eye as well. But it's quite a lavish and luxurious illustration to have included in the journal. By the 1860s and 1870s, there was also quite a lot of discussion amongst blind people themselves about the limits and the problems that were being caused by competition between different systems. And in the 1860s, a group of blind men and women started to advocate more strongly for blind people to actually have greater control and investment in embossed literature. So in the 1860s, a committee was formed of blind people led by a man called Thomas Rhodes Armitage, and they formed a society for improving the embossed literature for the blind. They tasked themselves with researching all the different systems that were in circulation at that point, and then they gathered together, discussed and published their findings. This committee was comprised solely of blind people or people who relied upon reading by the finger. So it was very much advocating that these decisions should be made by blind people themselves. And after looking widely into all the different systems, the committee felt that whilst it praised Moon's type, it felt that there were certain limits with the system, and one of the systems that it really strongly advocated and began to promote was a system that had been invented in France some 30 years earlier by Louis Braille. And I'm just going to show you some examples of Braille type. So Braille had been invented in the 1820s, 30s by Louis Braille, who was a pupil at the Institute of Young Blind People in Paris. If we recall, that's actually where some of the very first experiments, attempts at embossing literature took place in the 1780s by Valentine Auwey. Braille had been frustrated at difficulties of reading Auwey's script and set about adapting a military code into a system that blind people could read with. And Braille used a cellular system of dots, so 6 dots arranged in a cell. And his system included logographs, so contractions that would reduce the length of sentence scripts and make it easier, thereby making it easier for blind people to read. So Louis Braille died in 1852, and his system wasn't really very much used during his own lifetime. Actually, some examples of it have been exhibited at the Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace in 1851. But by 1854, Paris, the Parisian Institute, was starting to promote and to use Braille solely. So what we have here is a Bible from the 1860s, which is published in early Braille. And it's a copy of St. Matthew's Gospel. And it's opened on the frontispiece, which, again, it has the code to Braille's alphabet printed on the left-hand side, along with some of the raised script of Auwey's original Roman letter. And then on the corresponding side, it has the frontispiece information actually printed in Braille. Just to give a quick description, so it's a large book. It's about 20 centimetres wide, about 40 centimetres high, and about 5 centimetres deep. So when this group in Britain, this group of British blind men, started researching the different systems, whilst Braille had been frowned upon really, the committee identified some difficulties with Braille. They also felt that there were many benefits to the system, not least the fact that it would enable more efficient printing. They felt that it would reduce the size of books, and also crucially, it would enable better note-taking as well. So what we have here at the front is an example, is Thomas Armitage's Braille writing frame. One of the drawbacks of many of the other systems that were in circulation was it was actually very difficult for people to actually write in these systems themselves, so to produce embossed text themselves. Braille offered a much simpler system through its use of a writing frame and through the use of the Braille cell. So this is a very kind of Armitage writing frame. It's a very small, slight, portable item. It's about 15 centimetres wide, about 12 centimetres high, and the brass writing frame is moved up and down 5 different holes in the side of the frame. And then the letters are punched in reverse with a stylus. So this was one of the important benefits of Braille. Armitage and his colleagues became very passionate about promoting Braille. By the early 1870s, they were promoting it within Britain, and importantly in 1878, they advocated for Braille at a congress that was held on the issue of blindness and blind education in Paris. And really by the end of the 19th century, whilst moon type was still in circulation, Braille had really kind of risen to ascendancy. So when the first library for blind people was formed towards the end of the 19th century, they were printing texts in Braille. And it's really at this point that my kind of talk through of the history of embossed literature stops.
Heather's been talking about the history of reading with our fingers. Now I'm going to talk about reading with our ears. I'm standing next to a talking book record player. Now, a talking book was any narrative read aloud by an actor or someone else onto a gramophone record. And this made it possible for people who weren't able to read with their eyes or with their fingers to still hear books read aloud. The first talking books were made in the 1930s, but the technology originated back during the First World War. Then, a number of veterans came back from the war having lost their eyesight, either through artillery fire or shrapnel or gas or other chemicals that damaged their eyesight. One of the key figures in this story is a man named Ian Fraser. He came back from the war after being shot through the eyes by a German sniper at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. When he got back to London, he joined a group called St. Dunstan's. That was a charity designed to help veterans who'd lost their sight in the war. Once there, he began tinkering with a number of sound recording machines to come up with a way to record books onto records. Now, before the 1930s, it was impossible to record a full-length book because records could only store a few minutes of speech. So they could maybe hold a couple minutes of poetry, a couple speeches from Shakespeare, but not an entire book. That changed in the 1930s when record companies came up with the technology to make a long playing record that could play for up to 25 minutes rather than just 3 or 4. So once that breakthrough happened, the Royal National Institute of Blind People in St. Dunstan's were able to start the talking book program. The first titles to go out to readers were Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Joseph Conrad's Typhoon, and The Gospel According to John. Now that last one's one of the titles that appeared in Heather's material. And the origins of the talking book program were very similar to the first embossed books, and that a lot of religious groups really wanted blind readers to be able to read the Bible for themselves. So again, people who couldn't read Braille, this was a way for them to be able to read for themselves instead of relying on other people to read to them. And only about 20% of people at this time could read, 20% of blind people at this time could read Braille. So that meant 80% of people still needed a way to read books for themselves. And this was crucial for blind readers who didn't want to depend on, say, family members or volunteers to read books to them. A lot of accounts I've come across are complaints about having to ask people to read a book to you, or concerns about privacy, say having to ask someone to read a book that's possibly risque or a bit racy, something you might be a bit embarrassed about having your mother read to you. So talking book technology sort of offered one solution to this problem. Now I'm standing before an early gramophone. This is from the RNIB's collection, and it is from 1947. It looks a bit like a turntable and a suitcase, and in fact, it was designed to be portable. You could close it up and carry it around with you wherever you want to listen to books. Now, having spent some time traveling around London taking this talking book player to various exhibitions, I can tell you it's not that portable because it's very heavy, but you can see the idea. Now, a key thing to know about this record player is that it was designed for blind people to be able to operate it for themselves. So the needle here is missing, but the arm would have had a permanent needle, unlike many gramophones at the time where you often had to replace the needle. That was a fiddly little part, so it was much easier to have a permanent needle for when dealing with readers with vision impairments. And on the side, there is a crank, and you can wind it up, and then the spring-operated motor would play an entire side of a record. There were 3 different types of machines available. One could be plugged into electricity, another could be operated without electricity, and many blind people at this time were out of work, were impoverished, and living without electricity, so that was quite important. And then there was a third model in which you could listen to talking books on headphones. So again, a key element in terms of ensuring the reader's privacy. On top of this turntable, we have one of the earliest talking books that was made, and one of the oldest surviving records out there. This is a copy of Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, and it's made on a 12-inch shellac record. Now, one thing I noticed by picking this record up is it's quite heavy and it's quite brittle, it's quite stiff, because it's made of shellac. And that meant, unlike vinyl, it broke very easily. So one reason that a number of the earliest recordings no longer exist is because these records broke so easily. So I've spent a lot of time traveling around looking for early recordings over the last couple of years, and often when I find them, they're in pieces. Fortunately, we still have a couple early copies, and this is one of the earliest ones made. This was made in 1936, so the program's first year. And this record of Gaskell's novel was recorded by a man named Anthony MacDonald. He was the first reader of a talking book in Britain. And even though this isn't the first record made at that time, we can still hear what the first reader's voice sounded like. I'll play a recording in just 1 minute, but I'll mention that each of these records could hold up to 25 minutes, and the average novel would fit onto between 8 and 10 of these records. And these records could be shipped through the post in a sturdy container. Users didn't have to pay for records to be shipped through the mail. They only had to pay the cost of return postage. So I've been talking a bit about this technology's history and how they were made, and shown an example of one of the records. Now we can listen to what this early record sounded like. So I'm going to play a recording now of Elizabeth Gaskell's Victorian novel Cranford, read by Anthony MacDonald.
Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Recorded for the Talking Book Library for the Blind. Read by Anthony MacDonald. Chapter 1. Our Society. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple come to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighbouring commercial town of Brumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were there? The surgeon has his round of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford, but every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed.
I'll stop the record there before everyone gets drawn into the narrative. So there's an example of what the first readers in the 1930s would have heard when they were listening to talking books. Now, the reactions I've encountered by readers range from enthusiasm at being able to read again. Some blind readers thought that would never happen, to the sense that the restoration of this ability to read was a miracle, an act of divine providence. There aren't many accounts of what people felt like at the time listening to talking books, but we do have a letter written in 1936 by a blinded veteran named F.G. Braithwaite. So he wrote the following account about how he used the technology. This is how I enjoy the talking book. Every night at about 10 o'clock, I shoot the wife off to bed, then make up the fire, draw my armchair near, and, after having got a bottle of Worthington and a cigarette going, I switch on the talking book. Don't you think this is real luxury? Not being able to sleep much and being very poor at Braille, you can imagine how useful the talking book is to me. Now, one thing that stands out to me when reading this letter is that the letter could be by just about anyone until that final line, when Braithwaite mentions not being able to sleep much. A lot of soldiers suffered from traumatic memories of trench warfare in France and had trouble sleeping at night. So the talking book was a technology that helped them rest. And also he mentions being poor at Braille. So many people who lose their sight in midlife struggle to learn a new language at that point. So even though he could read a little bit of Braille, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't very useful for recreational reading since it was hard work. So the talking book is a way for him to relax and enjoy domestic comforts at the same time. Now I'd like to say a bit about this other strange device next to me. This is a reading machine from the early 20th century called an optophone. It was designed around 1913 by a lecturer in physics at the University of Birmingham. Now, it looks a bit like a desktop scanner, maybe a steampunk scanner, It has a glass top and then some machinery underneath it, and it operates much like a scanner would as well. So you would place a book on top of it, and just like a scanner, it would scan with beams of light the entire page. But instead of translating the printed page into electronic text the way a scanner would today, it would translate the printed page into musical tones. It's often been called the musical book rather than the talking book. So when these beams of light are scanning underneath the book through the glass surface, each letter would have a distinct tone. And anyone listening to the device would be trained into how to convert those musical tones back into language. Now, as you can imagine, this was a difficult process and a time-consuming one. The earliest demonstrations took place in London around 1918, when a woman named Mary Jameson gave examples of how to read a novel using this technology. The first exhibitions that she put on, she read at the rate of 1 word per minute. So that's extremely slow. The average speed of reading for a sighted reader is about 300 words per minute. So you can see how difficult it would be to hear these musical notes and then translate them back into verbal letters. But she did go on and get better at using the technology, and the technology improved over those years too to make it slightly more user-friendly. Mary Jameson, in fact, could read up to speeds of 40 to 60 words per minute around the 1920s, and she did become the first blind person to read a page from an ordinary book. This was extremely useful because even though she was an avid Braille reader, plenty of material wasn't translated into Braille. It could be time-consuming and expensive to do so. So if this technology could be used by everyone, it would be a way for blind people not to be dependent on the limited selection of Braille material out there. And it was invented just prior to the First World War, so slightly earlier than talking book technology. So the first novel that Mary Jameson went on to read then during these demonstrations was by Anthony Trollope, and it was called The Warden. We can hear an example from this machine, even though not many recordings survive. We do have more modern clips. So I have a very rough recording made of some of the optophone's early sounds. And this recording was made by Patrick Nye around 1965. He was working on technology to help blind people, and he reconstructed some of these early sounds for recording, and I'm grateful to Elaine Nye at the Haskins Laboratory for providing this recording. What we're going to hear then are the musical tones corresponding to the to 8 lowercase letters: F, I, K, J, P, Q, R, and Z. So I'll play that recording now, and you can hear a set of musical notes that would have been heard by a blind reader using this machine.
Firstly, the 8 letters scanned by the conventional optophone system.
Okay, so I described those notes as musical tones, but you can hear from those sounds at least it's discordant and difficult to follow, especially if you're trying to read a long work using this machine. So as adept as Mary Jameson was at using the technology, it wasn't easy and it wasn't practical for many other people to use this machine, and the optophone wasn't used much after the 1920s. You can see, however, the emergence of later technologies involving scanners, so optical character recognition scanning that we use today. So in some ways, even though this is a machine that isn't heard of after the 1920s, it's an important step in looking at the history of trying to find alternative ways of reading print. So these are just a couple examples then of different reading technologies designed to help blind people over the last couple of centuries. And it's important to note that a lot of this technology is still in use today. So people are still reading Braille, using refreshable Braille displays. People are still listening to talking books, using DAISY players or MP3 players.
So if you want to learn more about the exhibition and the events that we held around it as well, then you can visit our website, which is www.howweread.co.uk.